All right, so here's some news stories that were interesting. Let me just try and adjust the size of my window. There we go. All right, so NVIDIA has a container escape bug, and I wasn't aware of this. Apparently, NVIDIA is what's being used to run cloud machines. I'm weak on hardware. I thought NVIDIA was a GPU, not a CPU. It is a GPU, but apparently containers are running on GPUs used across clouds and AI workloads. Anyway, so they had to patch it for that. These things, we talk about them now and then, these container escapes, so you can escape from a container, which is like a virtual machine, but smaller and faster and much more popular. And for the last Security Now podcast, and other people have been saying that there is a critical Linux vulnerability coming, and they delayed the disclosure for a few weeks to give people time to do something about it. But there's no patch, and yet they're still releasing it today. So none of that really made any sense, but now it finally came out, and it turned out that this is the same old story I've seen a million times. I've even been on the other side of it. This is a researcher that finds something, and they think it's super important, but other people don't think it's that important because it really doesn't matter. So what he found was a flaw in cups. Now, cups is nonsense, and this is not surprising to me at all. I remember the first time I installed Linux, I looked for listening ports, and there's this thing called cups listening on port 631. And I said, what is that? That is the common Unix printer service. And I didn't have any printer on my Linux virtual machine, and almost nobody does. And that's why it can have a flaw, and nobody will fix it because it's some code sitting around that nobody ever uses. And it turns out that his exploit requires you to have turned on some feature that is not on by default on cups. So technically, the vulnerable code is in every Linux distribution, or most of them, but in practice, it's not going to really be vulnerable unless you're actually connecting it to printers and you're running this service that automatically finds printers. So there's some way to fool it by making it think it's connecting to a printer, and then you can execute code on the machine. And this kind of reminds me of a flaw that came by a few years ago where they found a flaw in the floppy driver for virtual machines. Because nobody's running virtual machines on hardware that has a floppy anymore, and that code has just been sitting there for years, unchecked and unused. And it's the same thing here. This is usually what you'll find. If there's some component of the operating system that nobody has used in years, then it probably is really badly out of date. It was written at an earlier time when people were less knowledgeable about security. So anyway, they made a big deal out of this, but in fact, it sounds like it's really not going to matter for many of us. There'll probably be some small number of Internet of Things devices or something that happen to have this service running, but it's not going to wipe out all the Linux servers or anything like that. However, this I'm very glad to see. We've been talking about this a lot on my podcast over the last few years. There is so much junk in space, so many dead satellites and fragments of satellites from collisions and such, that it's really hard to use space anymore. It's really hard to launch new satellites or new rockets because you have to fly through this cloud of junk that's all moving like as fast as a bullet. And so NASA has now made a contract where they're going to send up a thing called the Small Spacecraft Propulsion and Inspection Capability Mission, which is going to examine the satellites, and it's apparently going to try and latch onto satellites and drag them and deorbit them. So this is what I thought was prohibitively expensive. I vaguely remember some mission from China or something that tried this, and it was going to cost like $100 million to bring down one satellite. So we'll see. But this is what we need. We need some way to bring down the old dead satellites. So this may help clean up space. Now, I've been sort of waiting for this too. People seem to be condemning it, but I think it's necessary. OpenAI is the leading AI company, and they're funded by Microsoft. And the reason why there was a revolt about 6 months ago is because it was originally funded as a nonprofit benevolent entity that was going to develop artificial general intelligence according to strict ethics rules and then donate it to the world at large. And yet, Sam Altman, after a few years of that, said, well, forget about that. We're going to get tons of investment capital so we get enough money to really build this thing. It costs billions of dollars to train this thing. So it de facto has been acting as a for-profit corporation, even though it's supposed to be a nonprofit. And now he's going to officially switch it from nonprofit to for-profit, which is, I think, what it really has been all along. I think the charitable, benevolent stuff has always been pretty fake all along. So we'll see if he can wade through the legal minefield to make that happen. Saw a few articles about this. I didn't pay much attention, but it sounds pretty serious. The latest Intel processors have serious flaws. 13th and 14th generation have serious flaws in their handling power supplies, which lead to crashes. And this, I think, is part of the deal. I heard on the Pivot podcast that Intel's shares have fallen drastically, and Intel is in such trouble that they're probably going to be acquired. And Qualcomm wants to acquire them, and if they don't do it, somebody else will. And apparently, Intel's products have gotten so bad, and their management has been such a disaster that the company is sinking. They were a stable, rock-solid center of computing for decades, but they seem to be collapsing. And I guess this is one of the flaws. Their latest processors have flaws, and they've been trying many patches to patch them, and now they're rolling out yet another layer of patches trying to fix it. Go patch GI. Well, I don't know what that is. Anyway, all right. And this was pretty amazing. And you may recall a few years ago in the early days of the pandemic, around 2020, there were various power stations were getting shot up. All right, someone in chat said go Pat GI, and then they said Gelsinger, so I still have no idea. Maybe that's the CEO of Intel. I don't know. Anyway, so this is a group that did this. This woman wanted to spark a race war, which is also what Charles Manson wanted, and I think quite a few of the sort of Trump right-wingers, like the kinds that invaded the Capitol with a Confederate sign and stuff, a lot of them, I think, wanted to start a race war. This is something that's been around since the Confederacy in America, all the way back to our founding. There's people that really want to see a race war, really want to see the whites crush the blacks or something like that. And they apparently thought they could do it by destroying the Baltimore power grid. And the thing that I thought was interesting is she made a plan to destroy the Baltimore power grid. And what she said is all you need to do is get a rifle and put 4 or 5 shots through the center of the power grid, and you will destroy that substation. And all you have to do is to do that to like 4 or 5 substations, and you'll black out the whole city of Baltimore. And she figured this would be such a significant terrorist act that somehow it would start a race war. Now, I don't know about that race war stuff, but it is interesting to me that it's that easy to take down a whole city worth of the power grid, and I wonder if it's true. Anyway, the technical part is interesting. I know many people are very concerned about the weakness of America's critical infrastructure, the power grid and the water plants and such. And there have been a few cases where people shot up telephone switching stations and power stations. I wonder if it's that easy, that just 2 nuts with a rifle could just drive around and in a few hours shut down the whole power grid of Baltimore. If that's true, we probably need to put like better walls around those things or something. So HP has got more bugs, more 9.8 severity bugs. The maximum possible severity is 10. This is Hewlett-Packard, and apparently this is, I think it's the enterprise class Hewlett-Packard equipment, and they have something listening on port UDP 8211 called Proprietary Access Protocol Interface. So that's some kind of enterprise remote control system, and apparently it has serious vulnerabilities. So you can take it over without, having proper credentials and such. So that'll be important for some enterprise class servers. Remember, this scandal's been coming for a while. There were also some scandals in their baseband power remote control services. A lot of enterprise class computers do in fact have some strange listening ports for remote control, and they tend to be insecure. I don't think it affects home users. And so this is interesting. As you probably have heard in the news, I've certainly seen a lot, people will buy things like a home gadget or a movie or music, and then a few years later, the company will say, well, we're shutting down the cloud service and your stuff is going to stop working. So even though you bought this thing, like a doorbell, and thought you owned it and you could use it, in fact, it's dependent on a cloud service, and we'll just turn it off and then it doesn't work anymore. And so now the new California law is going to require them to inform you when you buy something. If what you're buying is not like a home appliance that you expect to own and use as much as you want, but you really are still dependent on some company that will just turn it off after a while. So that sounds like a good idea. They'll have to actually disclose the fact that you're not actually buying something. It's more like you're renting something. Anyway, that's all the news I wanted to talk about.